Hello. So maybe we give some time for people coming from the plenary to this breakout room now. We can't control how many people go in which breakout room, so it's really up to choice. That's why I at least mentioned the countries already, which will be covered. But even if we have a smaller breakout room, I think it's good to have a discussion, and then the others will still hear from our rapporteur what we discussed upon. Our rapporteur today is Diers Heidens from the European External Action Service.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Or
thank you very much, Diers. So I hope we have everybody here now in breakout room 2 on repression and resilience. I said during the plenary, these breakout rooms are really meant to be an interactive conversation and exchange. So after the inputs by our speakers, you can come in if you like and add. Sorry for the noise, there's a construction next door. We have 3 different speakers from very different countries. So even, as I said, we chose a comparative approach. Of course, we cannot compare these countries. But it's still interesting to look out for common ways of adaptation to repression. Is Ginny here? Yes. Ginny, I would like to start with you. You are coming today to us from Colombia. So what are your experiences in Colombia under the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to, for example, abuse of force? And what lessons have you learned during the pandemic? Thank you.
Hola Nora, buenos días para todos. Sé que te referiste a mí porque nombraste mi nombre, pero no entiendo inglés, entonces no entendí la pregunta que el traductor no realizó la traducción.
Sorry, Jenny, I have English on, but I couldn't hear the interpreter.
I'm afraid the interpreter should ask the question again, if possible, in Spanish.
Okay, and what does that mean now for the interpretation? Mm-hmm. I see, yeah, I can also hear myself belated. So I'm looking, everybody is muted. I can mute myself again when Ginny unmutes, maybe that helps. Okay, so this is a technical issue with the interpretation.
Nora, hello. Seems like you're looking.
Is there someone from Copa here who can help us?
Looking like you're looking at the stream in the same time.
Maybe mute original audio. Yeah, I had that, but I couldn't hear the English interpreter when Ginny started to talk. May I suggest something? Victoria, you are going to speak in English, right? Is there someone who doesn't understand English? Otherwise, we could start with Victoria until we have the Spanish interpretation sorted out. Is there someone who doesn't understand English? Okay. I mean, we have a rather small breakout room group here anyway. Victoria, so let me turn to you. You work for the Legal Initiative Belarus, which was liquidated recently. In general, the situation in Belarus looks rather grim, even without the COVID-19 pandemic. So how can you continue your work under this repression?
Hello, thank you so much for invitation, for organizing such important event, and for opportunity for me to share my views on situation in Belarus. First of all, if we're talking about COVID-19 in Belarus, so Belarus never introduced like any lockdown measures and even like mask wearing. So at the outbreak of the pandemic in early 2020, Lukashenko suggested that driving tractors and drinking vodka would provide like protection against virus. So this approach was initially met with criticism by population, and survey conducted in June 2020 shows that more than half of young Belarusians thought that president's decision not to implement any restriction on public life was a mistake. And even before the contested presidential elections in August 2020, the pandemic had contributed to an erosion of trust in the state. And independent non-state initiatives began providing access to personal protective equipment, first of all, for medical workers, because state didn't do something about pandemic and completely denied this problem. And as for human rights situation in Belarus generally, it continues to deteriorate. And the fact that now hundreds of people do not take to the streets of Minsk and regional cities as it was in summer and autumn in 2020, this fact doesn't mean that people have accepted these elections and this president. And of course, the protest changed, and despite the fact that the protest is not as visible as earlier, hundreds of people are being detained for political reasons. Now we have more than 900 political prisoners under criminal charges. And also, like every month, hundreds of people are being detained for a short-term period of jail. And as for conditions of detention in prisons, there are evidence of overcrowding. For example, like 3 people in a cell, an area of 5 square meters, and number of people like 10 people in cell for 2 people. So it's common situation for all people who are detained for political reasons. And of course, in isolation centers and in pre-trial detention centers, conditions are generally inhumane, and those arrested for political reasons, such conditions are created purposefully. Many are infected with COVID, and we know at least of a few deaths from COVID after release from such isolation center and pre-trial detention center. And of course, situation for civil society is very difficult now. I should say that, like, Belarusian regime has always considered civil society and human rights defenders as enemies, but of course now we faced unprecedented level of repressions. Like hundreds of NGOs were liquidated in one day on July 22 this year, and now it's about 300 of NGOs. And among the liquidated organizations are Belarusian Helsinki Committee, Belarusian Association of Journalists, and also my organization, Legal Initiative. These organizations have been working in Belarus for the protection and promotion of human rights for 25 years. Of course, many representatives of human rights defenders organizations have been and are being subjected of administrative and criminal persecution now. 7 members of Vyasna Human Rights Center behind bars, and some of them already received their prison terms, and some are waiting for trial. For instance, Mara Farabkova, who is the head of volunteer team of Vesna, now received her final charges of 11 articles of criminal code, and she could be she can receive the prison term up to 20 years in prison. So yes, it's very difficult now for human rights defenders to work inside country, because every morning we receive news about new searches, new detentions. So I think, in my opinion, more than half of human rights defenders left country. So we continue to work from neighboring countries, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland. And of course, despite the repressions, human rights organizations continue their work, which is now even more important than ever. Thank you. I think I'm done.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And I hope that, you can have the floor again and we can come back, but maybe we take this now as your initial input and remarks. And I'm glad to say that apparently we have interpretation back. Thank you very much, Victoria, now for laying it out in English. I hope it was understandable for everybody. Is there any question right away to Victoria? Otherwise, Jenny, I would like to come back to you on your experiences from Colombia. Please turn on Spanish, English, or whatever interpretation you need. Jenny, you have the floor.
Hola, muy buenos días para todos. Acá en Colombia todavía es en la mañana. Me presento, mi nombre es Ginny Alba, yo soy indígena del pueblo Piratapuyo, de la Amazonía colombiana. La experiencia que se han tenido desde los pueblos indígenas frente a la situación de COVID, pues se ha visto y se ha generalizado algunas situaciones referente a la vulneración de derechos humanos contra pueblos indígenas. Caso así que se han evidenciado más vulneraciones en el marco de la pandemia que lo que generalmente está sucediendo en el país. Algunos han escuchado en diferentes espacios, medios de comunicación sobre la firma del acuerdo de paz en Colombia, que finalmente este ha sido una aplicación un poco lenta, por así decirlo, que se ha agudizado la situación, la vulneración de derechos humanos referente a la situación de COVID-19. También, aparte de esta situación de vulneración a los derechos humanos, porque afecta a toda la población, a niños, niñas, mujeres, autoridades, sabios, digamos, se viven como dos conflictos o dos situaciones. La primera, referente al conflicto armado que está viviendo el país, y la segunda, referente a estas crisis de salud que se viven en las comunidades indígenas. El no tener acceso a una atención integral, el no tener los implementos necesarios para una atención a las autoridades indígenas, mujeres, hombres, ha hecho que muchos de nuestros líderes en Colombia hayan fallecido a causa del COVID-19. Lastimosamente han sido líderes reconocidos que han fallecido en el marco del COVID, y que de todas maneras que han sido esas personas visibles en el ejercicio y defensa de los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas, hace que un poco retrase los procesos de resistencia que se han adelantado con los pueblos indígenas. Se ha presentado también situaciones ya como una especie de revictimización frente a compañeros o pueblos indígenas que por causas del conflicto armado han tenido que desplazarse a las ciudades, en sitios o cascos urbanos de Colombia, y establecer como otros mecanismos de subsistencia para poder sobrevivir. Entonces han tenido agresiones por parte de la fuerza pública, en este caso del ESMAD, en sacarlos de las viviendas donde se encuentran porque no tienen los recursos necesarios para pagar un arriendo o una renta. Entonces están viviendo procesos o se vivieron procesos de revictimización frente a las personas que están desplazadas de los territorios en las ciudades y que no han existido unas garantías frente a cómo solventar esta situación en el marco del COVID-19 y cómo poder ayudar a estas comunidades si se decretaron, por ejemplo, para el caso de Colombia, se decretaron una restricción frente a la movilidad. Pero lastimosamente, pues en los territorios no hay cómo adelantar o cómo subsistir pues, si no se trabaja. Entonces, el generar estas restricciones, pues también va en contravía de cómo las comunidades indígenas y cómo las autoridades indígenas puedan adelantar, o más que adelantar, subsistir en sus territorios si no se trabaja. Entonces van unas cosas con las otras en materia de cómo se vulneran derechos humanos de pueblos indígenas, pero tampoco hay las garantías por parte del Estado colombiano frente a las comunidades indígenas referente a estos procesos, a estos temas de restricción que se imparten por el gobierno nacional. Entonces, quieren controlar el COVID, pero no se evidencia cómo también poder ayudar a las comunidades si no pueden salir a trabajar o no pueden salir a hacer sus actividades diarias, esto generó pues controversias referente a cómo pudiesen solventar esta situación del COVID-19. Pues adicional de ello, y ya muchos lo comentaban en el tema del panel, en el panel general, frente a los problemas de conectividad. En Colombia, los resguardos indígenas y comunidades indígenas quedan en las zonas rurales, donde no hay conexión a teléfonos de celular, no hay conexión a internet, y esto pues ha generalizado que niños no tengan acceso a la educación, que no se tenga acceso a la salud, que se generen graves afectaciones referente a que no hay una forma de poner en conocimiento la situación que se esté presentando en los territorios frente a la presencia de grupos armados, frente a situaciones de riesgo que se presenten en las comunidades, porque no hay cómo realizar esta comunicación con las entidades competentes. Digamos, ha sido bastante complejo en Colombia el tema del COVID-19, pero bueno, se están buscando ciertas alternativas para mitigarlo, y esto obedece pues a los conocimientos tradicionales también de los pueblos indígenas y también de la resistencia que hay frente a situaciones que se han venido presentando en Colombia. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Is there a question to Jenny from the audience? Or audience, I mean, this is a breakout room, so it's really, as I said, audience is like other participants. Maybe I have a question, Jenny. When you say you look for alternatives, is there anything you can say in a positive manner? Let's say, you know, what would you describe as a best practice to adapt to the situation of, you know, not knowing how to help these people? Can you think of any best practice you learned, maybe how to adapt to that, how to continue?
Bueno, lo que se ha venido implementando en Colombia, lo que se ha venido generalizando frente a estas situaciones en territorio, una de lo que se ha venido es el fortalecimiento de la Guardia Indígena, que son como los, para el caso de Colombia, pues sí se les llama Guardia Indígena, para el pueblo inga son los guasicamas, que son los primeros encargados de hacer esta protección o este proceso de autoprotección o prevención en comunidades que se presenten en el territorio, ¿sí? Digamos, es como una medida de autoprotección propia de los pueblos indígenas frente a situaciones que se estén presentando en los territorios. Otras alternativas que se han venido implementando con comunidades indígenas ha sido también el fortalecimiento de la soberanía alimentaria. El tener sus propios productos, el tener sus propias chagras, que es donde tienen sus propios cultivos, hacen que se pueda pues, sostener una comunidad. Pero esto no aplica para todos, teniendo en cuenta que la situación que algunas comunidades están viviendo frente a la contaminación de sus ríos por parte de las empresas petroleras, hace que pues, no sea sostenible tomar o alimentarse de un río contaminado. Entonces han estado buscando estas alianzas también con diferentes instituciones para solventar situaciones que se han venido presentando con las comunidades indígenas. Se han hecho también gestiones con algunas instituciones ONGs frente a cómo garantizar la conectividad para la escuela y para que los niños no dejen de estudiar en los territorios, que ha sido, digamos, es como de manera progresiva. No se ha hecho en todas las comunidades, pero se busca que algunas de estas experiencias se apliquen en los territorios.
Mm-hmm.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Ginny. I would like to have our third speaker of today. And Milena, I have to say, I'm not an expert on Palestine at all, so I really look forward to your testimony. You work for Adam Meir. What can you tell us about the situation in Palestine? And maybe, you know, besides the description, what way forward do you see?
Thank you, Noura, and thank you everyone for participating in this breakout room. To begin with, just a small brief. Al-Damir is mostly a prisoner support organization. So our work revolves around Palestinian prisoners held both in Israeli prisons and the Palestinian Authority prison. So similar to Jenny, in addition to the pandemic, but the Palestinians have another fight they fight, which is the Israeli illegal occupation of Palestine. So a bit my speaking time, or the conversation I will be given, is more about how the Israeli occupation has continued to use arbitrary arrests even during the pandemic. Just a small note about Israeli prisons, as also mentioned by other speakers in this breakout room, they lack the most minimum basic living standards. And during the pandemic, that still continued. There is overcrowding and insufficient hygiene equipment inside prisons available for Palestinians. So to begin with, since the spread of the coronavirus in the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel, as the occupying power, continued to fail to adhere to its moral and legal obligation to protect the right of Palestinians to adequate health and for living standards. The global pandemic did little to deter the Israelis' systematic, widespread, and unlawful policies violating the rights of Palestinians and justifying these measures as COVID precautions. Since the establishment of the Israeli occupation, they have issued over 1,800 military orders. These orders, in a way, aim to control and criminalize many aspects of a Palestinian daily life, including civil society work, advocacy, cultural expression, association, and movement, or any act that could be considered as opposing Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. These orders are, why I'm talking about it is because these have been the essential tool where the occupying power systematically arrests and detains Palestinians. So whether it is during the Sheikh Jarrah peaceful demonstrations against the forcible dispossession of Palestinian homes, or in Damascus Gate, or in Beit Nablus against settlement activities, the Israeli occupation used arbitrary arrest as a key attempt to repress the Palestinians' struggle for liberty. It's important to note that violence is embedded at each stage of arrest, whether during the repression of the peaceful protest or acts of solidarity, upon the arrest and transfer to detention centers, and during the period of detention up until trial. The Israeli occupation during the protests and even during a pandemic, they used tear gas and sound grenades, rubber bullets with rubber-coated metal bullets. They raided homes and they used physical and psychological assault against Palestinians. And we're talking about women, children, elderly, and even Palestinians with disabilities. The violence in the Israeli Occupations Act was not only limited against the protesters themselves, but in neighboring areas as well, which is again in violation of international law. So dozens of cases have been recorded of medical neglect after the arrest of the Palestinian protesters. This is important to note because as Al-Damir, we provide legal services to Palestinian political prisoners. Our lawyers were unable to allocate the Palestinian prisoners and detainees because the Israeli occupation used COVID measures in order to isolate prisoners before transferring them to detention centers, which meant that lawyers had to call every detention center in order to find where are the Palestinian prisoners. This is in addition to that Palestinian prisoners inside Israeli prisons during the COVID pandemic, there was several numbers of prisoners who were affected by, or they contracted the COVID virus. And this is we say a legal obligation on the Israeli occupation because, as you know, prisoners are held inside cells. They have no outside communication with the outside people or the outside world. So the only contact is through the prisoners. However, they still contracted the coronavirus, even when the Israeli occupation halted all family visits to the prisoners, which means there is some kind of medical neglect on the part of the Israeli occupation to protect the prisoners from the prison guards who have contracted the COVID virus from outside and brought it inside prisons. It's also important to note that our organizations were never given full or actual note when the prisoners have contracted the COVID-19, which means our numbers are based on our visits to prisons as lawyers, and we conducted searches and we conducted questioning through our prison visits to understand what is the estimated number of Palestinian prisoners who were affected by COVID. In addition to this, Israel's ongoing and systematic crackdown on Palestinian civil society actors and human rights defenders did not stop during the global pandemic. 6 leading Palestinian civil society organizations that work in different aspects of a Palestinian life, such as our organization Al-Damir that works with Palestinian prisoners, the Union for Palestinian Work Committees that works directly with Palestinian women to empower their role in society, and the Union for Agricultural Work Committees that specifically works with farmers and peasants in the West Bank area, in addition to another organization, which is Al-Haq, the Defense for Children International, and Bisan Center. These 6 organizations were criminalized and attacked by the Israeli occupation through designating them as terrorist organizations in the beginning, later in October. Despite international condemnation, after Israel's designation of these organizations as terrorist groups, the Israeli occupation doubled down the harassment on our organizations to issue a military order that completely outlaws our organizations in the West Bank. Why I'm sharing this information is solely because Israel did this to another Palestinian human rights organization, which is the Health Work Committees. The Health Work Committees is a leading Palestinian organization that promotes health services for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in marginalized communities, especially in Area C and women's health. During this pandemic, the Israeli occupation arrested 3 members of the Health Work Committee and forcibly closed the committee. In addition to arresting the director, who is Shada Oude, a 60-year-old human rights defender. The closing of the health work offices and detention of its staff during a global pandemic further illustrates Israel's disregard towards its legal obligation to protect the occupied Palestinians' people's right to health and constitutes a collective measure against the Health Work Committee and the Palestinian people as a whole. This in a way also affects the freedom of assembly and membership and association of the organizations and its staff, because this, according to Israeli military orders, the mere membership in one of our organization is now considered a crime and there is a risk of arbitrary detention. There needs not to be actual evidence of membership with these organizations. For example, this meeting itself could be affiliation to one of the organizations, and there could be criminal liability to any of the participants. In no way am I trying to scare anyone to stop attending these meetings, but on the contrary, we're trying to emphasize that the only way the Israeli occupation has reached this method of arbitrariness and authoritarian powers is because of the silence of the international community. What we propose, that a solution for this in a way is, you cannot leave the Palestinian people on their own to fight against an apartheid regime that is greater than any power in the Middle East. We ask the international community to stand against the Israeli occupation and stand with the Palestinian people, because targeting the organizations and the freedom of association and assembly is a violation and a target on the global human rights community and not only Palestinians. As I mentioned, we also report on Palestinian—
Milena, sorry, I need to ask you to come to an end, because we also
definitely. I am, promise. Just to end, as mentioned, we also cover Palestinian prisoners under the Palestinian Authority. And this year we have seen the Palestinian Authority also abuse the COVID measures and restrictions to limit the peaceful assembly and protest of Palestinians during the Palestinians' movements against the Palestinian Authority's killing of the political activist Nizar Bannat. The security forces of the Palestinian Authority used brutal and excessive force against Palestinian protesters who were protesting against the PA's use of force and killing of Nizar Bannat. So in a way, we need to understand that the pandemic did not stop any arbitrary measures, neither by the Israeli occupation or the PA. And hence why we call on the international community to abide by its responsibilities under international law and humanitarian law to take affirmative action against such measures. And apologies for taking much of your time.
Thank you very much, Melina, and I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but we also have less time for this breakout rooms than we thought of starting late. Maybe people who want to come in can switch on their videos, so this is a bit more personal, and if there's any pressing question, I would like to allow that before we, I think, have to go back to the plenary. And Diaz, you will have not an easy job to report back some takeaways from this session. I'm sorry for that. And I can maybe just also see the call of, that these restrictions, and that was also touched upon in the plenary, right, that the restrictions which were in place, but then sometimes were even put in place during the pandemic, that we need to make sure that they are being abolished again. I feel that we couldn't take, a lot of positive adaptation practices or lessons learned, but that's maybe also very difficult talking about very difficult circumstances in these countries. Is there any question from a participant or a reaction from one speaker to the other? Yes, do you have any question for your reporting back?
No. It was very interesting. It will be difficult to bring it briefly, but we'll give it a go.
Okay, so we go back to the plenary. I hope that I'm posting the right link now, but it should be this one. So Gopa, you can correct me or put the right link again in the chat. So we go back to